All right, welcome. So it's 12:30. We can begin our session. My name is Douglas Irvin Erickson, and it is my pleasure to be hosting this panel today with you. This is our book launch of Wicked Problems. So this book was co-edited by Ernesto Verdeja and Austin Choi Fitzpatrick. And I am going to place into the chat in a moment a promotional flyer for 30% off, which would bring the paperback cost down to under $18, which in my book constitutes a modern miracle in these days of publishing economics. But the book really did have its genesis in a conversation I had with Liz Hume back in 2018 for a workshop we were doing on building peace in America. And we were in quite a bit of dismay and a little bit of angst, I guess you could say, at a lot of peace building and conflict resolution processes that we were observing that were trying to do good things to build peace in the United States, but were actually doing a lot of harm and sort of a lot of unintentional harm. And this could be related to little awareness of local community dynamics, the experiences people were facing in terms of race, gender, poverty, and so forth. It could also sort of be kind of a lack of awareness of best practices. And Liz, in this conversation, brought up her many years of experience working internationally. And she raised the point that, the standard that peace building professionals and conflict resolution professionals tend to think of as the gold standard of ethical practice, the principle of do no harm, which of course we all know is the title of that very important book, Do No Harm, by Mary Anderson, that this principle of do no harm was not actually the gold standard in fields such as medicine, healthcare, nursing, education, social work, what have you. Actually, to the contrary, do no harm was the starting point. It was not the ultimate goal. So Liz asks, why should peace builders consider this standard to be the height of their ethical aspirations when everyone else seems to be considering it the foundation? And that's the point where I said, let's do a book, Liz. And Liz said, you do the book and I'll write the intro with Jessica. And the idea was born. So I took this idea to Ernesto and Austin a few days later, and the three of us put our minds together. And the result of this book is the result of this sort of brainstorming was the book that you have in your hands at this moment. We posed a simple question to all of the authors, which was, what are the ethical dilemmas you face in the context of your own work? And these are the kinds of dilemmas that, we were trying to get at, which had no good answers. Where two moral normative goods were pitted against each other, where every option that practitioners, peace builders, conflict resolution folks are encountered with, that those two options were actually both led to undesirable outcomes. And we wanted people who were engaged deeply in conflict resolution, whether that's people who are working in the streets and protest movements, social work leaders, organizers, professionals, professors, pundits, what have you. Anybody broadly defined who is engaged in conflict resolution, social change, peace building work. We wanted them to write about the trade-offs, the dilemmas, the compromises that they encounter in their daily work as conflict resolution practitioners, peace builders, advocates, organizers, and activists, and so forth. So we asked these questions. We had authors ask these questions. What happens when do no harm does a lot of harm? What happens when peace builders require one group to compromise with injustice? What happens, who decides, for example, who must do the compromising? Whose interests do we knowingly or unknowingly serve when we try to do good? If we know that our work serves the interests of ethically compromised institutions and social forces, why do we still do that work anyway? What does it mean to be an ally? Whose good counts as the good? This is a huge question. So for us, we titled this book Wicked Problems because wicked problems are those kinds of super complex social problems where there really are no ethically clear or morally pure solutions to be found. And we wanted authors to get into the weeds of the underbelly of the peace building field, the darker side that exists on top of our shiny narratives of doing good. We told our authors to answer this question with all the depth and rigor you'd find appropriate for a professional piece of writing. But here was the rub: to do it in a tone as if you were speaking to a room of those full, those people who are sort of full of energy and excitement, and wicked intelligence, somewhere around the age of 19 to 25, who were bursting at the seams with idyllic optimism and a desire to change the world. So, the kinds of people who fill the ranks of change-making organizations and NGOs who take to the street to let their voices be heard around the world. But also, those people who demand democracy be lived experience, and then who file into our classrooms as undergraduates and master's level students. So this was a tall order, and as Austin and Ernesto and I were last night proofreading the book, we were going through the proofs, and we said, I think we actually nailed this. The authors did this. So this was ultimately a 3-year process from beginning to end. The three of us hope that this book can inspire many more conversations and studies on ethics in the peace building field. We intend this book to be a provocative starting point and to inspire debate. And our hope is that this debate can happen in the classroom within the halls of NGOs, on Zoom rooms of different activists, and maybe even in some peer-reviewed journals, and so forth. Alas, wicked problems for us in this book is really, we're approaching this as like a kind of Gordian knot. And Gordian knots must always be met with debate. So we hope this book sparks debate. So we have with us today Jessica Baumgartner-Zunick, who most of you probably know very well from all of her hard work organizing PeaceCon. Jessica is Senior Director of the Learning and Evaluation at the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and she's going to be talking today about her co-authored chapter with Liz Hume, which covers the pressing need for the peace-building field and thus related fields of practice in the conflict resolution, conflict transformation, and social change space to develop a coherent and robust system of professional ethics. This was originally our lead chapter until the 11th hour when we decided to flip it and make this, I'm going to really do a terrible building metaphor here, but we turned it from the foundation to the keystone piece. And if you pick up this book, you'll notice that it's paired at the very end with a chapter by Agnieszka Piesinska and Susan Hirsch about the teaching of peace in conflict zones. And our intention here was that as students could read this in a classroom, it would sort of lead up to this conversation about these two really important institutions for peace builders, right? There's the peace building profession, and then there's the classroom. But anyway, this is very much sort of a framing device. So we're going to start with Jessica. Next, we're going to move to the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis and Gnome Sandweiss Beck, who will share their insights, from their chapter on the movement to end poverty. So Liz is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and the director of the Carios Center for Religion, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary. Gnome is the director of partnerships for the Poor People's Campaign and the program manager with the Carios Center for Religion, Rights, and Social Justice, also at Union Theological Seminary. And in due course, I'll put a link to the Carios Center into the chat. Then we're going to have a short video interlude to play for you, featuring a number of authors from this book that were interviewed by co-editor Austin Choi Fitzpatrick. And then finally, we're going to turn to Ernesto Verdeja, one of the three co-editors, and who's going to talk about his chapter on the ethics of mass atrocity prevention, and then offer some concluding thoughts. So hopefully, if we can get this all done with all of the panelists taking 10 minutes each, we'll turn to Q&A. And when it's your turn to speak, we're going to ask you to turn your camera on to ask some succinct questions. And perhaps as we go through, it would help maybe if you jot some questions down. That way we can save about 30 minutes of conversation time. And hopefully this is a great conversation to follow up what are exciting chapters. And with that, I will turn it over to Jessica. And as Jessica speaks, I'll drop stuff in the chat to everyone. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. And what a really lovely introduction to a joyful project, as Doug said, we've been working on for a while. I know that Doug shared my bio and that'll be in the chat. So, I'm just going to kind of dive right in. And as a researcher and an economist by trade, the wicked problem that I really wanted to bring to this in alignment with Liz Hume, the Executive Director of Alliance for Peacebuilding, is this question of how do we develop research standards and ethics for the peacebuilding field. so that we're not just following our personal values or morals or this idea or concept of doing the right thing, but are held accountable to each other and just as, if not more importantly, to those we're looking to serve. You'll hear me talk about subjects, you'll hear me talk about beneficiaries, and I think the terminology here is very important. And I think this is one of those ongoing debates that we certainly need to engage in as a researcher. And I'll talk a little bit about this on what is the role of a subject or what is the concept of a subject in researcher. But when I first started to reflect on this concept of moral alignment, where does that come from? I immediately was taken into, and you can all forgive me for my nerdhood, Dungeons and Dragons, and the idea of moral alignment for your character development from this lawful to chaotic and good to evil kind of component. And I think often we get this misperception that scientists or researchers, they fall within this neutral zone where the pursuit of knowledge is prioritized over the morality of society and or beneficiaries or subjects or those we're really working with. The peacebuilding field is an interesting nexus because there's this pressing need for rigorous research to develop effective programming, both so we understand how to do our work better, so we can seek more funding, professionalize our field, and just as importantly, really make the case for peace and what that means writ large. So as Doug was mentioning, besides the principle of conflict sensitivity and do no harm, our field is not governed by an ethical code or standards, in particular in relation to conducting research. This relative vacuum poses several dilemmas for us, both as practitioners, researchers, etc. And questions like what are trade-offs? What trade-offs are acceptable in the pursuit of the answers we're seeking through our research? How and when do we rigorously follow our methodologies, potentially at the expense of the rights of our subjects? Are we even able in an unbiased or rather biased world to impartially determine when we're privileging research over the well-being of the individuals we're working with? How do we adjust for and account for asymmetries in power relations when we're working with vulnerable populations? One sec. And then I think really this broad question of when does the answer justify the cost? And I'm not just talking fiscally, but more importantly in relation to subjects' rights and moral standings. My husband would joke that I fall within a lawful good category of moral alignment because I strongly believe in the need for systems of law that allow us to have strong standards, but also provide and help guarantee and enforce that accountability for, in this case, strong research ethics and standards. Other fields have a very long history of research ethics, and they've been developed over courses of time to really help protect research subjects. And I'm sad to say that comes from centuries of failures of researchers to do so as a matter of course. And there are so many examples where the rights of subjects have been manipulated or flagrantly, disregarded in the pursuit of research. So this threat, though, for our field is even more relevant because we're already operating in a context of upheaval where there's threatened livelihoods, there's potential and overt political violence. We're inherently working with vulnerable individuals. So this is so much more important for us given this context. So the idea, though, for me of a researcher as being purely neutral, it's not sufficient. And we do require stronger standardization, I would argue, to help save us from ourselves and to make us stop and reflect and ask these difficult questions of ourselves and our field as we move forward in professionalizing and the stronger pursuit of research and knowledge. The Alliance for Peacebuilding, we are the leading field building organization. We're working to support, to develop, and advance the peacebuilding field. And as part of our new strategy, overtly focused on field building, one of the first major components is actually creating standards of practice to align the peacebuilding field around common purpose. And this is not just in relation to implementation, but just as importantly in relation to research. Within this co-authored chapter, Liz and I outline and recommend the adoption of 6 minimum standards for conducting research that I would argue in many ways still apply for programming across the peacebuilding field. So I'm going to go over each of the 6 relatively quickly. We go in a little bit more depth in the chapter, of course, and would welcome any questions as they come forward. But number 1, I think this should be pretty overt, is applying conflict sensitivity to all aspects of our programming. This is not a one and done or a checklist component, but this has to be at the forefront of the work that we're doing to make sure that we are being conflict sensitive, we are not exacerbating conflict dynamics, and we're reflecting upon our role as soon as we enter into any situation where conflict or violence is happening. Number two, we have to establish robust design, monitoring, and evaluation principles, DM&E, I'm going to call it moving forward. Our field, we need to better understand and improve not only our impact, which we've been pushing for many years, and I'm sure many of you have heard me talk about this requirement of a field-wide cultural shift for us, that we need to focus on valuing transparency, we need to embrace open inquiry, and we really need to share best practices, knowledge, learning of not only our successes, which we tend to do pretty well, but just as importantly, our failures. Our field writ large will be improved, and I'm sure we would be able to prove this with rigorous data by employing ethically informed design, monitoring, evaluation principles, because we would then design based on evidence-based programming, evidence-informed programming. We would be monitoring programming for ethical abuses and accountability, and we would certainly be reflecting on evaluations to assess not only the impact of the programming for meeting our donor requirements, our organizational requirements, but just as importantly, on the participants' requirements. What is it that we affected change in their own lives, in their own environment? Number three is securing informed consent. Coming from the development field, the idea of informed consent being first and center of any type of research was almost unquestionable. And it was very interesting to me coming into peacebuilding and that not being the case, because it is commonly required when conducting research, particularly in collaboration with academic institutions or specific donors. But I would argue that any time that an organization collects data, whether to look at their own effectiveness of a program, to report to a donor, to evaluate hypotheses or their evaluation, they're doing research, and it would require informed consent from participants in a very formal and standardized manner to make sure that we do have minimum standards of guaranteeing this across all of our work. This improves not only the quality of our research, but of course it improves the integrity as well, and helps guarantee that the dignity, the human rights of participants, these are at the forefront of our research considerations. Our fourth minimum standard is adhering to best practices for ethics approval of programming. IRBs and ethics committees are quite common in a lot of fields as well, and I'll be very open and honest. Of course, they pose their own dilemmas and their own challenges. They tend to be very top down in terms of how they approach research. We have some sort of institutionalized standards of ethics, questions of who sets those standards, who contributes to those standards. We obviously have this question of treating research participants as subjects rather than collaborators or co-collaborators in research. But I would really contend that the risk of not having them poses a much greater threat than our ability to overcome these individual challenges. And I think one thing to note across all these recommendations is these are not meant to be single, one and done, set in stone, but a way for us to move forward as a field. And we should adapt these and make sure that they're relevant to the context in which they're operating. Number 5 is upholding data protection and privacy rights. We, of course, need to do a better job at safeguarding beneficiaries' data and privacy. I'm sure there are many people in this room who have received data on a USB or been emailed content from a program, or, God forbid, use free source open Google Docs to capture participant data. I mean, it's rife within any field. We need to obviously be very aware of that on how we're protecting the privacy and ensuring best protections of our participants. We also, though, run into this interesting component of what's called dual use or misappropriation of data, because it's so easy, given the context in which we work, for our data to be misappropriated and used by other parties, potentially those who are party to the conflict in that sense. So we have to balance the known and unknown risks and benefits of data collection and use. And I think this is a very delicate balance. When and how we identify data that an organization or a donor or our field needs to collect versus what we want to collect. And how does that balance with a cost and benefit to the risks of the individuals participating in our work? And I think that the last comment I'll make on that is, in my experience conducting research in many countries throughout the world and participating domestically as well, we need to stop treating other countries as research laboratories and really stop and question ourselves when we collect data. And I often use this as a first check, even on myself, when I'm creating tools to engage with different environments or cultures. Is this something I would ask in my own country? Would people feel comfortable if I walked out my door and posed this question to people on the street? There are, of course, cultural and influences that would change some of those components, but we often feel that, well, we're there, and because we're giving money or we're doing something, we have a right to ask this question. And I think that is a basic first step in asking ourselves, how would I feel if someone posed this question to me, to reflect upon the greater need for privacy and protection. And the final one would be transparently sharing our results. As I said, both successes and failures. So of course, while protecting data, but making sure that as a field, we're learning collectively and together. So, again, going back to that wicked problem, how do we develop research standards and ethics for our field? I would argue that we require more than just doing the right thing to govern our practice and ensure our programs and policies not only don't exacerbate the conflict dynamics, but guarantee the safety and well-being of participants. Because if we believe what we do is important, and I think that is something shared across our field, we do need to ethically prove it. So as I said, what I've outlined here with Liz is really just the beginning. It's a bare minimum, and it's a starting place for us to help advance the field, but it's an absolute requirement for us, not only as a moral imperative, but a best practice, as I said, to help safeguard the dignity, the rights, and the well-being of the populations we're looking to serve. Thank you so much. I will hand it over to our next speaker, and I look forward to questions and answers. Looks like we actually might have lost Doug here for a quick moment. So I'm going to say Liz and Gnome, and we'll hand it over to you.
Perfect. Well, it's really an honor to be here with everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation to be a part of this amazing conference and panel. I was deeply honored, along with my colleague Noam Samwise Beck, to get to submit a chapter for this amazing book, looking especially at the connection between poverty and the eradication of poverty and the project of peace building, and the kind of wicked problem of inequality and abandonment in the midst of abundance. So to start here a little bit, I want to use a quote that's in the chapter, one of my favorite quotes about violence, from Coretta Scott King, when it's very shortly after Dr. King has been assassinated, and someone has kind of come up to her to say, what do you have to say about violence? Your husband was killed, violently, and what, isn't this terrible? And then she has this clarity about kind of broadening the definition and understanding more fully the level of violence in a society, one that she was living in, 55 years ago, when she made this comment. But I think it also applies still to our time today. And she said, in this society, violence against poor people and minority groups is routine. I remind you that starving a child is violence. Suppressing a culture is violence. Neglecting school children is violence. Punishing a mother and her child is violence. Discrimination against a working person is violence. Ghetto housing is violence. Ignoring medical needs is violence. Contempt of poverty is violence. Even the lack of willpower to help humanity is a sick and sinister form of violence. And so I kind of wanted to start my presentation, our conversation, with that quote, because I think if we're serious about really addressing the injustices in our society and getting at some of these wicked problems, we have to have, as Dr. King would say, an accurate diagnosis of the problem to be able to come up with a good prescription to it. I have been involved in grassroots anti-poverty organizing for more than 25 years. and throughout that time have seen the level of structural violence in our society that is particularly kind of posed at and seen through the lens of poor people in these United States, or maybe these yet to be United States today in 2022. There are 140 million people who are poor, or one job loss, one healthcare crisis, one small emergency from economic ruin. That's 43.5% of the population. That includes the fact that half of kids in this country are living in homes that are food insecure, and the fact that at some point in 80% of people's lives in these United States, folks will experience some form of poverty. And again, this is in a society, the richest country in the history of the world, a nation that throws away more food than it takes to feed everybody, not just in the country, but in the world. A society that has basically 5 abandoned houses for every homeless person, and yet has tens of millions of people who are unhoused in this country, with the average age of a homeless person being about 9 years old. And so I think what we brought to this book and what we bring to the project of peace building is a perspective that that you have to look at the whole of a society to see whether there really is peace and justice at its core. And living in a country that also has fewer voting rights than we did 50 years ago, and the largest attack on voting rights since right after the Civil War and the Reconstruction, and yet inaction in the face of that, where you have the folks that are hurt worst and first by climate chaos and climate change, being poor and marginalized people in the United States and across the world. And we have a nation that spends, upwards of half of every dollar on the military, that has just passed a military budget that is $750 billion just for a year, more than actually the Pentagon asked for. And yet that same nation is struggling to figure out if it will invest in early childhood education, or extending a child tax credit, or actually lifting from the bottom so that everybody can rise. And so it's really out of that perspective that we have formed something called the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and are organizing all across the United States, building bridges with folks all across the country and world, trying to come forward and saying that to live in a peaceful, to live in a just, peace-building society, we have to address systemic racism and poverty and ecological devastation and militarism in the war economy and the false narrative of religious, especially Christian nationalism altogether. And that to get rid of one, we have to get rid of them all. And the only way to really save the soul of our society and to save the lives of millions and billions is to kind of lift from the bottom and organize from the ground up. And so I'm going to pass it to my colleague and co-author of this article, Gnome Beck, who will go a little bit more into the work we're doing and the contents of the chapter.
Thanks, Liz. It's great to be with everyone. I'm honored to have been invited to contribute this essay and to join this panel. Liz, as the commensurate organizer, is on the move, even as she's speaking, which I think says all you need to know about the work that she and we are doing together. I think a little bit based on what Liz has shared on I think the conditions that we've emerged through and really helped to lay the groundwork for our assessment that something like the Poor People's Campaign was necessary. I wanted to just share a little bit about the piece that we wrote. And we were asked by the editors of this book to reflect on, in some ways, the state of violence in American society and the question of effective strategies for social change, and in particular the question of the ethic and tactics and strategy of nonviolent direct action and nonviolent collective action, which is a core tenet of the work of the Poor People's Campaign. So I could describe what we wrote, but I actually wanted to just read a little bit of what we wrote. If you'll allow me, just a couple short excerpts from our chapter, and then hopefully hand it back off to the facilitators to have a discussion. So we start the essay by writing, social movements in the United States have long confronted that most wicked of dilemmas: how to counter the violence of the state with a genuine vision of human rights, and how to make that vision a viable political project. In the richest country in the history of the world, we are living, as Liz said, in an era of abandonment amid abundance. But just because poverty and interlocking ills like systemic racism, militarism, and climate change have become endemic to our lives does not make them inevitable or permanent. These systems of violence are based in policy decisions that can be undone and replaced by a shift in national priorities. That kind of shift has only ever come in this country through mass social awakening, emerging out of movements that are able to build irrefutable power and rouse the conscience of the nation. Our assessment is that such a movement today depends on the ability of poor and dispossessed people to come together across lines that have divided them and to bring larger sections of society to a more just vision for the nation. If this is the goal, nonviolent action and civil disobedience is a political strategy to win. Our adversaries are better funded, trained, organized, and armed. They wield the combined power of Wall Street, media, academy, police, military, and government. A ground-up movement will never succeed if it tries to match the rich and powerful on their terrain and by their terms. But we do hold one key advantage in this country. Those who suffer from the status quo, who are considered to live in the margins, actually make up the vast majority in this country. The 140 million poor and low-income people Liz was speaking about. The poor, then, are a sleeping giant whose strength lies in their numbers and ability to unite and rally all people of conscience into moral action. In April of 2020, Senate Majority Leader at the time, Mitch McConnell, told the press what would happen to proposals around environmental protections and universal health care if the Republicans won in the next election. He, quote, said, if I'm still the majority leader, think of me as the Grim Reaper. None of that stuff is going to pass. In the growing shadow of the worst public health crisis in at least a century, McConnell mocked the prospect of a guaranteed right to health care and a livable planet by comparing himself to the harbinger of death. McConnell committed himself and his party to perpetuating the violence that Coretta Scott King spoke of decades earlier and that Liz quoted just a few minutes ago. So in this essay, we discuss nonviolent action and civil disobedience from the vantage point of history and strategy, but we also hope it is clear that we offer these strategies in service of a larger moral vision for the country and the world. Debates about violence and nonviolence become abstract and fruitless if they are not dedicated to a future in which violence itself no longer exists at a structural level and people have access to resources they need to live fully and abundantly. If we are serious about winning, we must invest all of our energy into forcing this nation to undergo a moral revolution of values, one that recenters the attention of society around the needs of the poor and all who are oppressed. Today, then, it is the poor who have the least to lose from big change and the most to gain. This suggests that those who are excluded, exploited, laid off, and locked up are best placed to be a leading social force, to spur not only their own communities into action, but the millions more who gain nothing from the current system and are given just enough to maintain the false promise of stability. To win such a battle will require a mass movement that can imagine a fundamentally different moral narrative about not just what is necessary, but what is possible. In the face of deep suffering, the wealthy and ruling elite have always tried to brand the Grim Reaper's scythe as a tool of pragmatism and moderation. When that has failed, they have used physical force to bring unruly communities to heel. Both methods mean only violence and more death. On the other hand, organized communities among the poor and dispossessed have surfaced and fought for solutions that uphold the sanctity of life. And throughout history, as the poor have realized the power of their numbers, strategically utilized nonviolent action and civil disobedience, and succeeded in rallying society around a moral call, they have also won. So that a little bit of the piece that we wrote. It's a little bit of the legacy, the theory of change that we, Liz and I, come out of, that helps to ground our work with the Poor People's Campaign. We're delighted to be here with you all and to talk more about our work in this chapter when the time comes. So back to you all.
Well, that was just wonderful. Thank you, Liz and Gnome. My connection crashed out at the previous transition, so hopefully I'll make it through this transition. But I would like to say one of the things that Austin and Ernesto and I felt so strongly about was that a book on the ethics of peace building had to include the perspective of practitioners who practice peace in the streets, in the movements, and through actual campaigns of leading people. But also people who are engaged in the daily struggles of everyday folk. And that this is a perspective that we thought should not be left out and actually should be front and center. And I really appreciate your contributions to this. So we're gonna turn to some videos that we've got. Jessica, can you help me cue that up since I have failed to figure out how to do it? Great, thank you.
I'm Austin Choi Fitzpatrick, one of the editors of Wicked Problems. One of the reasons I love this book and I love this project overall is that we get to hear from people about everyday ethical dilemmas that they face as they do the work of peace, rights, and justice around the world. We've got lots of really big and important conversations, questions, and books about ethics in the abstract, but what I love in particular about these contributions is they take us right into the action. So I sat down with a few of the contributors and asked them to explain to me what the ethical dilemma, the wicked problem was that they tackled in their chapter. Let's go ahead and have a look.
What happens when an ally who's not really a member of the group that the movement or the organization is intended to benefit ascends into leadership? What kind of challenges and opportunities emerge when that kind of situation happens? And it's a tricky situation because there are real resources that person brings into that leadership role, but there's also a lot of challenges in terms of how they might negotiate that space and being more directive as a leader.
A lot of the tools that we have to protect civilians are based in the use of force. And when we do that, we can often unintentionally create more violence.
Lawyers are tasked with upholding the rule of law. But what if the law is unfairly skewed to disadvantage certain groups of people, and upholding it means being complicit in injustice?
The wicked problem that my chapter attempts to address arises in situations of armed conflict like Yemen or South Sudan or Syria, where one or more of the parties is a villain. And the ethical dilemma then is whether to include the villain in a negotiating process, which might mean sharing power with the villain, or attempting to remove the villain through coercive means, which might include use of force.
You know, in my chapter, if I successfully argued that Black armed resistance is part of a collective ritual to dismantle or abolish American policing, the ethical dilemma is for white liberals. And specifically, if white liberals want the police to protect their self-interest over the liberation and lives of Black people, then my question is, at what cost? So at some point, white liberals have to choose a side. Is it going to be a side of a humanistic, moral self-defense for the collective? Or are they going to side with the state and the empire in using a history of anti-Black police violence?
right. Thank you for helping me out, Jessica. And we're going to pass this to Ernesto Verdeja, our last speaker of the day. Ernesto is Associate Professor at Kroc Institute and Department of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. His bio is in the chat.
Thank you so much, Doug. I appreciate it. And thank you all for coming out for this book lunch. We're really excited that you have all joined us for this. In that video that you just saw, you see a number of different authors speaking about what the particular chapter is about. We've also heard a little bit from the folks on this panel itself. And in thinking about wicked problems, we're really encouraging and asking people to think through questions, for instance, of how in a really difficult topic or issue around violence or conflict, how we might understand competing interests, how we may understand the difficult challenges involved in compromising while remaining committed to core values, and also delving down deeply into understanding uneven power relations, which often affect questions of standing, who gets to speak legitimately, who's excluded, etc. So that's kind of the general thinking behind this book. And in many ways, the book is an attempt at trying to draw a connection between folks who are in scholarship and kind of in scholarly institutions, but really reaching out to practitioners as well as scholar practitioners across a really wide range of topics. So you've seen this a little bit today already. My chapter that I'm going to be talking about just for the next few moments concerns atrocity prevention, and particularly international atrocity prevention efforts. So it deals with ethical dilemmas in international atrocity prevention. It's based on studying and having kind of studied for many, many years cases of atrocity prevention, as well as doing consulting work on and off for a number of years in the world of atrocity prevention practice. And in the chapter, what it really seeks to lay out is the nature of ethical dilemmas in atrocity prevention, as well as provide some general guidelines on how to reduce some of these tensions or some of these dilemmas. The idea is not so much that the dilemmas can be resolved we call them wicked problems precisely because they don't have an obvious or absolutely straightforward answer to them, but it's a way of trying to mitigate them, trying to address them, what their constitutive elements are, and trying to think of ways to think through them, to kind of work through them so we can understand better what our options might be. In my chapter in particular, I look at these dilemmas, and I basically begin by trying to think about, well, if we're going to think through the nature of what the dilemmas are in atrocity prevention, we have to have a sense of at least what some of the core principles and core values at the heart of atrocity prevention are. And interestingly, this isn't actually very well worked out in the atrocity prevention world. I think that's understandable in many respects. People who come into this world already come with a whole set of relatively well-established and clear norms and values. And then the question is how you actually put those into effect to protect civilians who are being targeted, et cetera. But it is remarkable that it's not nearly as well drawn out as you find, for instance, in the sphere of humanitarianism, which has a pretty sophisticated body of reflective literature and thinking and debate around core values. So my chapter starts off with sketching what I believe are some of the core values of atrocity prevention, or really what I call them principles. And I'm not going to go through the entire chapter in detail, but it'll give you a sense of kind of what's operating here in terms of thinking of wicked problems. So when we think of principles, I lay out 4 key principles at the heart of atrocity prevention. You can think of these as normative principles. One is dignity, or a recognition of the inherent moral worth of all people by virtue of being human rather than membership in a particular group. There's also the value of empathy, which concerns a general awareness and sensitivity to others' suffering, regardless of their particular identity. Universal responsibility, which is something you see articulated in different ways, but never really kind of systematically worked out. And this effectively involves a moral obligation to care for others who are in dire need. Though, of course, in atrocity prevention, the threshold of responsibility, this idea of universal responsibility, is highly contested. It normally is around the idea of atrocity crimes, right? Genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and so-called ethnic cleansing. But the very idea of where significant intervention should be catalyzed, what that threshold looks like is itself open to some degree of political and normative contestation. And then the last important principle is, of course, do no harm, which comes out of humanitarianism. That's where it's kind of earlier articulated. This notion that practitioners should act in such a way that avoids or reduces the risk of exposing people to greater harm. And without getting too philosophical and too technical about it, the do no harm is really a side constraint, if you think about it. It really doesn't tell us what to do, it just tells us the parameters in which we ought to operate. And that's about as far as it takes us. So the chapter kind of explores some of these questions to sketch out effectively how atrocity prevention should understand itself normatively. And the argument here being that these 4 ethical principles justify and orient prevention work and provide much of its normative coherence. If those are basic principles, the overlying or fundamental ethical end or aim, of course, is to protect civilians, and particularly to end or minimize severe human rights abuses against civilians. In this respect, it overlaps significantly with, say, conflict mediation or conflict resolution, but it's not quite the same thing, where the emphasis there may be on a cessation of hostilities. And we can think of many examples where these kind of come into tension. And then lastly, one of the important things when we think about kind of how to even understand dilemmas is to appreciate the role of power. One of the things that has always struck me in a lot of the debates around responsibility to protect and these broader debates around how to protect civilians under conditions of ongoing atrocity is you have broadly kinds of 3 different worlds here operating, right? You have philosophical discussions about the nature of obligation, deontological duty, supererogatory, etc. You have legal debates about what is legally obligated and what the placements are on the so-called international community. And then you have practical debates about how to actually carry out the protection of civilians and military interventions and sanctions and all these different things. But there often isn't really a lot of kind of interplay between the 3. And so one of the points here is that any attempt to think through the nature of ethical dilemmas or these wicked problems in atrocity prevention has to think of power not only in the sense of power relations in particular contexts, but power as constitutive of atrocity prevention work. And what I mean by that is that this entire domain is characterized by unstable and asymmetric power relations. So that power concerns not only the regulation of what people can do, but also its constitutive. It constitutes the actual field of atrocity prevention. And what this really means in more practically speaking is that power relations frame what qualifies as an atrocity worthy of attention. So this is a product of different power relations. Who gets to kind of say what qualifies? Who is authorized to speak and decide on a course of action? This itself is also a product of different power relations. So you think of, for instance, the professional peacebuilder, the person who has expert and lessons learned under their belt, to the exclusion of people who don't have that kind of knowledge but are deeply rooted in the particular conflict and are kind of going through the lived experience of it. And then thirdly, following this, power relations determine who is excluded, right? So power is kind of at the very center of this. And that's what I mean when I say it's both regulative and constitutive. The chapter actually devotes a fair amount of time trying to think through and frame clusters of dilemmas. Some of these dilemmas involve dilemmas specifically in framing. So they deal with challenges around defining when atrocities are occurring, what cases qualify as mass atrocities, who gets to label these. And this concerns all sorts of issues around selectivity. You know, one thing that we find, for instance, is in atrocity prevention, we often like to talk about a case and compare it, for instance, to the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide as a way of really generating international interest. But in the process of doing that, for every Rwanda, there are many Cameroons, right? There are many other cases that don't fit the paradigm very well, and they risk being excluded because of the way that they're framed. Secondly, other problems with framing include simplification, trying to simplify the dynamics of a case of violence for the purposes of popular and public interest, but at the same time, that can lead to exhaustion, and it can actually encourage really problematic solutions to it. Think of Coney 2012. For an audience like this, I don't have to say much more than that, or the way the Darfur genocide was earlier framed. And then lastly, there are questions about who speaks. So differences between global North actors and global South actors, but even within the so-called global North, really significant variation there in terms of status and legitimacy. So there's a set of questions of framing, and then there are a whole cluster of dilemmas around acting. Dilemmas involving, for instance, under what conditions should one accede or accept the demands of violent actors when they are demanding security or status guarantees? How do you do this if the trick is, of course, that this is one way of trying to protect civilians, but it leads to all sorts of problems of accountability and responsibility? I explore some of the questions around the use of force and how that presents another dilemma. And then thirdly, collaborating with states and the importance of, or the need to collaborate with states for creating atrocity prevention architectures and for creating atrocity prevention programs. But some states, like the United States or Great Britain or France, are both important actors for atrocity prevention and human rights, but they can also be major drivers of violence themselves. because of course they pursue their own national interests. So how can we kind of think about these dilemmas in a systematic way? Different states have different relations to all of this. There are states that are more like those. There are other states that, for instance, might be regionally important. They're repressive at home, but they're important interlocutors more regionally. Take Rwanda or Uganda, right, who have played a really important role in kind of thinking about peacemaking in the broader region. And then there are states that effectively don't really want to participate too extensively in any of this, like China and Russia, but they're extremely important states. So the chapter tries to think about these dilemmas in collaborating with states by trying to crack open a little bit the different classes or clusters of state interests and how they operate. And then the final part of the chapter, after kind of laying out these different dilemmas, is to think through what various ethical responses might be. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go into this, and I think the conversation that we'll have more broadly for the panel is more interesting than me kind of going in detail about the points in the chapter. But broadly speaking, what I try to do there is I try to identify a set of normative guidelines for atrocity prevention, how to kind of think normatively about how to respond and deal with these different dilemmas, and then also a set of practical guidelines. And the normative guidelines really involve being very clear about how particular interests or particular efforts in a given case should harmonize or be in line with the basic values and the particular ends that I laid out earlier. So that's just kind of an intellectual, but also a moral check. And then also the importance of reflective practice, right? That is moving away, not only thinking of responses as technical responses, but also thinking kind of more broadly, morally and ethically about what these responses are advocating, what they're advancing, and what's being left out. So that's kind of the normative guidelines. It speaks very much to what Jessica was just talking about a little bit earlier as well. And then secondly, there are a set of practical guidelines, which is really about clarifying the specific aims of particular policies and actions, how they might be in tension, but really laying out in detail set of expectations. How do we measure success? How do we understand success? How do we operationalize indicators of success? And what kind of evidence is appropriate? And the reason why this is so important is because when we're dealing with mass atrocities, we're often working in a very reactive set of circumstances. We're reacting to things as they're happening. So the information coming in is very anecdotal. The way in which we make sense of it is anecdotal, and it draws selectively from other cases that we're familiar with. So it's important to kind of think of this in a more systematic way. The final part of the chapter also lays out some important observations on the need to create an actual global architecture for atrocity prevention, so that it reduces some of the dilemmas in a slightly more manageable way. There are, of course, trade-offs with this. The more we focus on process, the more we move away from substance. This is one of the challenges always with the UN, right? So there are various kind of trade-offs here. I'm going to end there, but that gives you a sense of at least what my chapter is about. And hopefully, as you listen to these different presentations and as you kind of saw the video, you'll get a sense of how rich the set of discussions, how really interesting and provocative they are. And even though they draw on many different cases and many different topics, different time frames, different levels of analysis, etc., you can also see how they're all contending with clusters of wicked problems that bedevil peace building across different ranges and across this whole continuum. But nevertheless, they kind of require our shared reflection and shared engagement with them. So thank you.
So look at that, a panel of academics who made their time limit. That's pretty good. So we've got 20 minutes for Q&A. I will say that the book is equally fast-paced and moving. The chapters are short, they're readable, they're fun to read. And with that, I'm going to suggest that we take some questions and have a conversation. Jessica, how do we do this? Should we invite people to click on live in order to speak? Should we take some raised hands?
Yeah, so if you are interested in, can you guys hear me? Okay, sorry. I was getting a notification that I was still on mute. If you guys are interested, anyone in the audience, on coming on camera and posing your question, please just raise your hand. We'll be able to turn you and kind of give you permission to access live. You will have to enable your camera and your microphone from your own end to make sure those protections are there. Or you can also post any of your questions in the room chat. We can pose those as well from Doug. So like I said, your raise your hand functionality is up in the upper right-hand corner, and you can just click on that if you'd like to come on and pose a question. Okay, it looks like we have one. So David, go ahead and you need to enable your camera and there we go.
Hi, can you hear me and see me? There we go. Hi. My name is David Tragott. I am a first year student at American University's International Peace and Conflict Resolution Program. And I have a specific interest in genocide studies and genocide prevention. And I just got the recent idea that I want to do field work in Rwanda this summer, which is kind of crazy. And I wanted to ask those of you involved in genocide research, what specific techniques and practices have you used personally to kind of lessen the traumatic impact that you have on people that you're interviewing or surveying?
Should we, Ernesto, do you want to take a shot at a quick answer and then I can follow up?
Sure. So I'll just say there's really kind of broadly speaking two parts to this, right? I mean, one part is the technical part of developing the appropriate methodological and research skills. So whether it's ethnographic or archival research, know the language, study the history, all of that. That's really, really important. And that's what makes you a scholar. The second part, which I think gets back to a lot of the questions that have kind of been coming up and are explored systematically in the book, is the importance of your own sensitivity and reflection on your own positionality. And I know that sounds really academic, but what I mean about that is being really kind of aware and sensitive to what it means for an outsider to come in and talk to people about really difficult and profound and frankly traumatic experiences. So my one piece of advice, just to be really kind of upfront about it, is you want to avoid situations where you're directly asking people about their experiences, right? So one of the difficulties here is that in many areas, and Jessica already talked about this, is that in many communities and scenarios like this, folks often already feel like they're being treated like research objects and not as people. And as an outsider, no matter how good your intentions are, the intentions don't define the way they interpret you. That's not enough. So I suggest actually trying to find out if there are organizations connected with your university or with faculty whom you know that already have a footprint there. You can kind of work through them and they can kind of walk you through it. Frankly, Rwanda is a really hard place to be able to talk to people about it, partly because of the political scenario, but frankly, because people don't want to talk about it with people whom they don't know. That's just a set of general observations. I imagine Jessica and Doug and others might have thoughts.
I mean, Ernesto, my sense of reflects your sense of, your answer to that question, which is a lot of times people in countries that have experienced trauma become overstudied. And from their perspective, they've seen every year hundreds of American and Western European students walking around, right? So there's often this sense that, that there's a kind of an exhaustion that sets in for a lot of people. And it's going to be important for, for people to remember that the people that they're engaging with have sort of seen lots and lots and lots of researchers come by. And that's, I think if you're going to begin to think ethically about your own positionality there, then all of a sudden there are avenues to do productive and meaningful work. And there are avenues to do things that are important and for the benefit of humanity and so forth. Tony Gascue, who was in this video, also gave a presentation last year to our school, pointing out that there's a long history of people in the global north getting PhDs and getting tenure, based on the research of people who have suffered tremendous amounts of violence and trauma. And I think that's important to bring that to that work. I think if you remember that and you keep that in mind, but also keep in mind that Rwanda is extremely politicized about the memory of that violence of 1994. And you don't want to be asking questions that are going to put people in danger. I think if you can keep those two things in mind and work with your advisors, your mentors, I think you can do something productive. So can I do a transition here into a question that was in the chat, which was asked by David Rosenthal. As someone who is very new to peace building. I consider myself a non-traditional student. Is this a good book to help me learn some basics? And I'm going to use this as a transition to Liz and Gnome, because this book is not a how-to guide. And our whole principle is that actually the how-to guides are extremely flawed in their approach, because what's really needed to think about ethics is not a universal standard of how to do things that always applies to every situation, but rather what happens when you're in the mess of real life, when all of a sudden none of those guides matter anymore. Everything you learned about ethics in the textbook of how to do it doesn't apply, because every option you have leads to harm or no good. And there's a certain sense that's captured in this book, which I really appreciate, which is that people who are in the middle of this work are reflecting upon the hardest questions they face. And so I think in that sense, I really love Liz and Noam's chapter, because it presents us with all of what you would consider the standard ethics of nonviolent contentious politics and social movement and organizing, but it does so in a way that really gets at these core dilemmas. So I can pass this to you if you want to reflect on the previous question, if you want to reflect on this one, if you just want to ad lib and go off script, that's cool too, while we wait for other hands to be raised.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. In some ways, maybe connecting the two questions. So I am the granddaughter of Armenian genocide survivors. And much of the work of doing justice that I have done and my family has done has been really through that lens of and that part of what I would, not as a practitioner or as a scholar of genocide and genocide prevention, but I would say that if we're gonna look at ways of addressing violence and war and murder and genocide, we have to have a holistic view of things. But if we're going to be doing research, and if we're going to be trying to also have a kind of 101 introduction to these issues, I think we have to be coming from a perspective that it does not have to continue. We do not have to have unending wars. We don't, our world should be able to evolve to a place where there is no more genocide and conflict and war and violence. And that therefore, in the way that we're conducting interviews or doing work, and Ashley, as someone who has done some of this work amongst folks, both that are currently experiencing, extreme violence and poverty and other positions, as well as, in my own families, as we've kind of reflected and tried to learn from the Armenian genocide, being willing to be in conversations and be in partnership and be in work and collaboration with folks that are actually trying to prevent and end those current realities, and not just study things because it's interesting, not just try to analyze things because they seem like relevant issues, but coming from a place of kind of abolition, that this does not have to be, and that we must actually be focused on addressing and ending these issues. And so in that way, also to then reflect a little bit on the book, both our chapter and excited about the other ones that are in it, in terms of introducing some of the basic kind of dilemmas and questions and in problems and issues, both of the world, and then that people are trying to solve with how we're trying to solve it. To me, that's a great way to be introduced to kind of the peace building field, not with just this and this and this, but here are these problems, and here's how people are trying to solve them and resolve them, and almost an introduction to people to join in that work. And so I think again, from the perspective of what we tried to include in our chapter, it is about kind of the theory of change that we're operating from, our analysis of the problems that we're trying to solve, and some of the the kind of methodology of getting involved and doing that work. And so I believe that you can surely kind of apply that to work at a very local level in a Rotary Club with young people, because I think that's exactly what the movement that I'm a part of is about, is how do we, analyze and understand the issues, have a understanding of then therefore what we're trying to do, and then how do we kind of get involved and do that work. And so I mean, that would be a little bit of how I jump in.
Gnome, do you want to add anything, or should we go to Ashley, whose hand is raised?
Yeah, no, more questions are great, so feel free to, yeah.
Perfect. All right, so Ashley, you're up.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for this really enriching discussion. I'm wondering how can we start moving away from it being folks from the global north conducting research on folks and in countries from the majority world, and start to shift that focus to supporting researchers from these countries instead. So I'm kind of thinking, we do a lot of talking about decolonization, but how do we kind of start practicing what we preach and putting that into action?
That is a great question. I'm going to suggest that all of us have ideas on this. My own approach to this has been I just haven't published any of the work I've done in Burundi and Cambodia. Never sits right with me. I decided I'll get my tenure on other stuff, and instead, that's just the way I've solved it in my own life. But I get that question. I think I would like to sort of pass this over back to Liz and Gnome for a second as we transition to other people on the panel, because your work with the Cario Center, am I getting that? Did I pronounce that Greek right? Yeeks. You can correct my pronunciation in a second. But this is really exemplary for its elevation and bringing up into the ranks of leadership and mission and work and centering all sorts of people who are themselves the very human beings that the movement seeks to work for. So I would like to sort of have you talk about that for a second, and then we'll transition out to the global north thing.
Thanks, Doug. And thanks for the question, Ashley. I really appreciate it. The pronunciation was close, Doug. Kairos. Kairos. Old Greek word. There's a couple different conceptions of time in ancient Greek. Chronos is chronological time, and Kairos describes a particular moment in time that's sort of ripe for transformation.
I got to see in my Greek translation example.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a great word, and I think we actually chose it because we really think it defines and describes the conjuncture we find ourselves in today in the world. A moment when the old ways of the world are dying, and new ways are yet to be born, and that's where movements of poor and dispossessed people really can exert real leadership. And I mean, it actually speaks, I think, a little bit to Ashley's question, or maybe just my interpretation of it, which is, we've been in long-term dialogue and conversation with movements around the world, movements in both the global north and global south. And often when we are in those conversations with folks like the landless workers in Brazil, or shack dweller movements in South Africa, or fisher people movements in Southeast Asia, we often will be in those rooms and folks will ask, how do we from the US build movements that are in solidarity with the work you all are doing in your context? And the answer in almost every case from folks on opposite ends of the world are, go back home and build a movement to end poverty in your country. That is the greatest value added that you as Americans can do, is actually to confront the rotten structures and systems in your country. We know that the US is, one of the greatest purveyors of violence in the world, and that if you can actually shift and transform the political systems and structures in your country, the effects on us in our context are enormous. And also then building a movement that can actually help change the conditions for the 140 million plus people in this country who are poor and low income. we've just been in countless conversations with folks who have articulated that sense of clarity and that also real concern from folks living, like I said, in Brazil or South Africa for our fellow humans in this country. And so I think that that's a really fascinating sort of lens shift that we've often experienced on the sort of question of human rights, the role of the US in global politics, but also the responsibility we have to build that kind of movement in this country. And so that's some of how we've developed international relationships with social movements of poor and dispossessed people all over the world and been in strategic dialogue with them over the years. Want to share just that little bit of it. I'm sure Liz might have a little bit more to say, though.
I'm happy to jump in, but I'm also welcome and ask folks to keep on posing questions. But in the meantime, I think the other piece I would add about scholarship and academia, not just kind of making a career out of kind of talking about other people across the world, is one of the things that I take a lot of issue with is often what folks will talk about, giving voice to the voiceless. And people have voices and they're out there using their voices and screaming and writing and thinking and singing. And, this is true amongst the 140 million people who are poor and low income and unhoused and without health care in the United States. And this is true all over the world, especially movements of those that are most impacted by injustice. And I think we would do well to make sure we're listening for and partnering with and then taking instruction from many of those voices. And I think there is amazing work happening, but we don't always hear about it. I think the fact that this compilation of articles and this book exists is amazing, because I think, from folks that are in the field doing the work alongside of many folks, being able to put that out there is really important. And I would encourage all of us in this world, especially in this peace building world, to make sure that we're hearing and that we have ears to hear what's going on out there, because there are things moving and people are crying out for justice for sure.
I have one thought on that, but Jessica, I don't know if you wanted to jump in, since I know you've thought about these types of questions as well.
Well, I'll give you 30 seconds very quickly, because I know we're coming up till time there. Because one, I know Ashley, and I know this is a very important question. And I know there's other comments in the chat on how critical this is. And I think there's a lot of practical questions and practical solutions. I can speak from my own firsthand experience. I think that's probably the only one I'm entitled to provide. But I think one is, I think as a researcher, I would say the best advice I always give individuals is to get into the field, wherever that field may be for you. And that is just as importantly on the home front as anywhere else, because I don't think we know often the barriers of our own knowledge or understanding until we're confronted by them firsthand. So whatever that firsthand experience, and I think is very important, because it really challenged me in many ways to understand some of the biases that I brought to work, and just even ask questions that I was unfamiliar with or didn't even know to pose. I think educationally, we need to do a much better job at preparing upcoming peace builders and individuals in these fields to understand what a life of service really is, and how peace building and research integrate within that, and how they in some ways confront each other. But then I think also in the funding community, we need to do a better job on advocating for, and not giving voice to, but stepping aside and making sure that others have that space to be heard within. because I do think sometimes, as Doug was saying, being able to step back and say, I'm not the right person, even if, how does that contend with other types of ethical dilemmas for funding, for programming, and who receives that and why and when. But I think we have hard questions we have to ask ourselves in practice and really commit to moving, as I said, either aside, back, or forward if we want things to change. Ernesto?
Yeah, so just to wrap it up, there is actually a chapter in the book by Philip Gamagelian about precisely the importance of big funders to step aside, because they can just create so much distortion of local and regional peace building efforts. The last thing I'd say, just from a scholarly perspective, so just one small thing that kind of nests in with everything else, is the importance of making knowledge that is developed in the global north and only circulates in the global north, making it much more available, much more widely. Because part of the problem with this issue of expertise is that the people who have most access to what counts as expert knowledge have the resources to actually access it. And it's really, really hard. Doug and I are on a journal that went open access to scholarly journal, and the idea behind it was precisely so that people in the rest of the world could read it, and they wouldn't just be objects of study, but they could be part of the conversation. It's a very, very small example, but we need to think much more creatively of ways of actually having access to information in a way that's open and shared, and not simply presuming that it has to be behind a paywall that you can only get because you're a member of a university in the United States or something, and that counts as knowledge. That'll be my last point. I know we're out of time, so I don't know, Doug, if you'd like to wrap it up. And I also see there's someone from Peace Direct, so that's great. It's a great organization. Thank you.
And you're muted, Doug.
We have committed the Zoom sin of our 2020. Talking on mute. Well, I was saying really eloquent and nice things, and I don't think I'll remember what I said. But really, thank you for just a great panel and really great questions. I will continue to make plugs for the book. I think I would love to have everybody present. But such is life, and I'm really thankful for the conversation here, and I hope you all just go to the bookstore in the that PeaceCon has set up, and at least check out the table of contents. Thank you everyone for a great session. Keep up the good work, everyone, and see you in other panels.
Thank you.